So, first of all, welcome to everybody. This is the first Moore Kingston Smith Family Business Group's webinar. It's going to be a series, we hope. And so welcome to everybody that has joined us. We do have a few more people who are due to join us, but as we've said, but they can join us as and when they arrive. So my name is Sylvia Vitiello. I'm a partner with Moore Kingston Smith and I head up the Family Business Group. And my fellow partners here today are Yvette Jacobs-Lee, who is a tax partner at MKS. And Yvette and I have worked together for many years with many family businesses. And Andrew Bloom, who is the solicitor and head of our legal department and a very active member of our Family Business Group. We've worked together and he's provided me with very much needed legal input to many of the clients over those years. As I said, this is the first in a series of webinars by our Family Business Group, and we are aiming to bring you practical insights and some thinking to family businesses, just to help you really lay foundations or build on foundations for your business and for your families, to help examine areas that arise in the interaction between the people in your family and your business. So simply helping really to take advantage of opportunities and avoid problems where possible. Now, in our first webinar, we're going to be looking at an area that is central to businesses all over, but is sometimes overlooked a little by family businesses, and that's roles and responsibilities within the business. If you have any questions, then please do pop them into the chat function and I will pick them up at the end and we will attempt to give you an answer for those. So I'm going to start off by just really giving a very brief outline of what we mean by roles and responsibilities. There are many other variations you can imagine in any business, but put simply, there's usually three that we look at from a planning, a tax and a legal point of view. So management, when we're talking about that, that's the day-to-day management, the operation of the business. Those people would receive salaries and bonuses, and they're usually going to be treated as employed individuals. You then have that sort of layer of the strategic thinking, typically called directors, and they would receive salaries or consultancy fees. And then finally, investors. So those are the shareholders in the business. And again, they would receive their money from the business via dividends. Now, having clarity around the roles in a business is vital. It's sometimes overlooked, I think, by family businesses because things sort of develop over time. It's part of the positive of a family business that you have a legacy and things move and evolve, but it also can mean that there are lines that get blurred, boundaries simply are unclear, and therefore sometimes expectations by individuals become unrealistic or unattainable. So setting in place a structure to joining, participating in the business and the remuneration that attaches to that is going to be really important. So I'm going to turn first to Yvette and ask for her to start by talking to us a little bit about the areas that she comes across from a tax perspective when you're looking at those roles that often operate within those family businesses.
Thanks, Sylvia. So as Sylvia said, where individuals might be wearing more than one hat in the context of a family business, it's important to distinguish how we remunerate people for these roles. So typically, senior family members might be directors of a business, and those directors may or may not also be undertaking a day-to-day role working in the business, or that role, that management might sit with other members of the family or other external people. But for these roles of management and office holder, I mean, we would advise that a market value remuneration is paid to those individuals for the work and the contribution that they're making to the business. But depending upon the stage of life of the individual and their personal requirements and desires, I guess, this may be split between cash remuneration, perhaps pension contributions, benefits, maybe commonly see private medical, but also sometimes cars and other private costs being met by the business. And where that remuneration is commensurate with the services that someone's providing for the business, then we can expect a corporation tax deduction for that in full. So this can be contrasted with the position of a family shareholder. So a shareholder is in the position of investor, and they can expect a return on their investment by way of dividend distributions. And that's where the cash is available for dividends. And these are agreed by the directors in a board meeting. So in lots of family businesses, the directors and the shareholders, of course, are the same people. And in the past, perhaps the tax rates and the tax regime have encouraged some businesses to remunerate people working in the business, so their executive directors, with dividends. So for a long time, the dividend tax rate was a bit more favourable, but we've seen a shift with that now. And certainly changes in corporate tax rates mean that salary is becoming marginally more favourable. And in many ways, that makes it clearer for the distinction between the people working in the business and the investors, and how they receive their share of the pot, if you like. And of course, if you've been following what's been happening in the tax world, in the press and so on, cuts to national insurance last week are going to make salaries even more attractive from next year. So the pendulum is swinging that way at the moment. Something we still talk about quite a lot, though, is using different share classes to divert different sums, different returns to groups of people. And care needs to be taken with any of these type of structures. If we give one group of people share A, another group of people share B, changing how dividends are voted and how they're paid between those group of people can be treated as disguised remuneration, certainly in HMRC's eyes, and raise a challenge. So we need to take particular care in any of those type of arrangements, but it's often something worth looking at when you've got different groups involved. Andrew, how do we manage some of this from the legal side?
Thanks, Yvette, and thanks, Sylvia. Yeah, it's really important to have certainty as to everyone's position, whether we're talking as an employee or a shareholder or a director. And often the devil's in the detail as to how you document that in legal terms. So starting with if people are employed, they've got to have employment contracts setting out the sorts of things that Yvette was mentioning in terms of their salary, their benefits, those sorts of things. And even if people aren't employed on a full-time basis, they might have employment contracts for part-time roles or consultancy agreements setting out what pay they get for their part-time roles. So that's really, really important. When it comes to people participating as shareholders or directors, if you've got a certain amount of profits in the business, you might want to distribute it all to shareholders, or you might want to keep some back to reinvest or to hold as a cash buffer. And that's where a dividend policy can come into play. And it's important to have agreement and not have disagreements as to how you might deal with that. Equally, as Yvette was saying, if different groups of shareholders have got different classes or different types of shares, then you need to set out what their rights to dividends would be. Also, do people have the right to just have information about what's going on in the business, or do they have the right to actually be a director? When you have board meetings of directors, however formal or informal, what happens if there's disagreement? Does somebody have a casting vote? Do other people have more or less say? Those are really, really important decisions that need to be set out in writing, because if there's disagreements, they can be much more difficult and costly to resolve. If somebody is a director, do they have responsibilities that go with that role? Are they in charge of marketing or business development or product development or things like that? Or do they just have a general role to think about the general future of the business? Are they supposed to show up for board meetings, or do they just have the right to be a director in case they want to? These are all really important things to consider. People as shareholders are also important, because as shareholders, you're the owner of the business. Mm-hmm. What happens if one group of shareholders want to dispose of their shares and that they want to transfer some shares because somebody maybe outside the family has offered money for the shares? You might want to put restrictions on that, saying that's not allowed at all, or only after the existing family members have had an opportunity to buy the shares first. Other things to think about is if the majority of the family had an offer to sell the business, they might want to force everybody to be what we call dragged along, or people might not want to be left behind and they might want the ability to tag along. So those are all sorts of important things that need to be set out in the legal documents. And we've seen, and I'm sure many of you will have heard, that it can be very, very toxic and damaging for a business if people start disagreeing in that way. But hopefully, if everything's agreed in advance and the documents set out what people's rights and responsibilities are, those sorts of disputes can be avoided.
Thank you, Andrew. That's absolutely, key, isn't it, to make sure you get some of those agreements and the discussions in advance. So we talked a little bit about the roles in the family business, but of course nothing stays unchanged. So you could have something set and working very well, but what we wanted to look at also was succession planning. Now that can be quite a difficult area to navigate for many businesses, unless you have, again, structure and understanding as to what succession really means for your business. So developing the team to meet the needs of a changing business. All businesses are changing all the time. And that can be really helped if you have something that you can fall back on to give you an understanding. What I found that works really well, and I've used it quite a lot recently, is the family business chart, the family charter rather, which helps to set out a link very clearly between the family and the business and how the two work together. Now, I don't have time on this webinar to do the family charter real justice, but I will dip into it just to give you a sort of visual understanding as to what I'm talking about. Ava, would you be able to share the slide, please? We just have the one slide. It's not death by PowerPoint, I promise. So we have the family charter. You can see that it's sort of constructed a little bit like a house. I'll just go through very, very quickly. I think as with any building, you'd need to have a very solid structure to your charter. And so at the bottom, you can see it's all around vision and values. That's something that the family holds true and the business has developed over the years. Putting that in place is really important to have that articulated. And all family businesses will have it, but it may not be articulated. And some of that work around putting down on paper, putting out in words what is considered to be the actual structure around the vision and the values of that entity can be really useful. I won't go through everything on here, but you can see we've got the 5 building blocks around governance to leadership and those sorts of things. Again, that's really important. That helps with the operational side of the business and how it's developed over time. And either side tried to find 2 words which sort of matched. The imbue, so that's around the culture of the family. Culture will eat strategy for breakfast. My fellow partners know I say a lot of that, but unless you actually live what you're thinking about in your charter, it really won't work. It will destroy the strategy. So imbuing, understanding, being able to articulate what your family's structure is about. And then of course, renew is a really important thing to have, that you come back. It isn't that you do it once and it's done forever. It will be something that you revisit. So it touches, as you can see, on roles and responsibilities throughout those 5 building blocks, all around the ownership, the employment, the governance of it. And that gives you an opportunity to dip in and to understand what the roles are. Now, the family charter will set out the thinking and the plan. So when it's completed, it will be a really complete document. But as Andrew will point out, I'm sure, and he will tell us very shortly, that it doesn't replace legal documents, which must be in place. It may inform what those legal documents will look at, and it's a really good practical tool to use, but it must have the backing of the legal documents. So our charter could show, for example, who is in line for succession, and if somebody isn't fitting into that, then it can highlight what the skills are that are required for that and give them an opportunity to fulfill that role. And a robust succession plan can really safeguard the family's financial legacy and allow the business to grow. Now, really important, thank you, Ava. We could probably do away with the slides now. If anybody is interested in the family charter, you can come to our webpage on MKS, and there's a little bit more detail about it, and it will set out far more. As I say, I can't really do it any justice at this moment. But as you create the plans, there are, of course, legal and tax implications that come out from those plans, those areas that you've articulated. And I think maybe if I hand over to you, Yvette, and ask you to go through some of the tax issues, particularly that we've seen as we've worked through family charters with our various clients.
Yes, thanks, Sylvia. I would say the biggest issue we face with succession is the timing for passing on shares or ownership of the family business to the next generation. And when thinking about that, tax can be a really important consideration, especially where lots of clients we work with have significant value in their business. And so tax can be a real bite, a real chunk of that. So for a business that's wholly or mainly trading, we can expect to benefit from business relief from inheritance tax, which provides 100% relief for value passing, either through unquoted shares or an unincorporated business, and that relief will apply either in lifetime or on death, and it certainly is very valuable for lots of clients we work with. But for lifetime gifts, we also need to think about capital gains tax. And again, thinking about trading businesses, it can be possible to defer, or it's called hold over, the capital gain that arises on that gift by making a joint election. And that can be a great solution where that relief's available. But many of the business we work with can't use the holdover relief because it's an investment business, or it has a significant investment element. Anything sort of more than 20% will mean that relief isn't available to you and your business. In which case, clients often see passing shares through the will as the major option, because there's a tax-free uplift for capital gains tax purposes on death. And so we can just cut out that lifetime charge altogether. Another option can be piecemeal gifting, or also often we look with clients at growth shares. And this can be an interesting tool that works for businesses in all sorts of circumstances. So if you've not come across them before, the basic idea is that we create a new class of shares which entitle the holder to participate only in future uplift in value. And then those are the shares that are gifted from the older generation to the younger generation. And because these shares only have a right to something in the future, they have a low value at the outset. So very helpful for capital gains tax purposes, because we're not giving away so much value at day one. And also that can help reduce the value that's left in the older generation's estate, because we're capping off the value of the shares that are retained, because all the growth is being pushed into the growth value. Sorry, the growth shares, you've got the growth value. So there's lots of legals to think about there, Andrew, but what other things do you talk to clients about when it comes to succession?
Well, those are all really good points. And just to pick up on one of the things that Sylvia mentioned with the family charter, one of the key things to agree with people is usually that it wouldn't, as Sylvia said, would not be legally binding, and to make that clear, because then if you've got legal documents that when you thought about them a bit more in a bit more detail, they're not they're a bit different. It is really important that there isn't any disagreement between the two things. So that's a really important to clarify. But the family charter can be a great thing that people can kind of do themselves on a more informal basis, and then put in place the underlying legal documents. Growth shares are a great idea with the right tax planning, as Yvette mentioned, and those will also be set out in the Articles of Association of the company and a shareholders agreement, along with the other types of things that I mentioned. It's vitally important for people to have up-to-date wills and to refresh and check those wills every few years, either when circumstances change, the values of assets change, people get married, die, have children, families change, and it's important to update those, not just so that the right people get what you want them to receive, but also so that assets can be distributed in the most tax efficient manner as possible. So that's something that's really important. One thing that we find lots of our clients are doing is putting in place lasting powers of attorney for LPAs. And there's two different types of those. One are for health and general welfare, and the other one type are for business and financial matters. And there's a lot of detail as to the sorts of decisions that could be made for somebody. But if someone was to lose capacity and be unwell and unable to make decisions themselves for a long time, it's really, really important that they've decided that whether or not there's someone they trust who can make those decisions on their behalf. We've dealt with a couple of cases actually where people didn't put those sorts of plans in place. We had someone who was the sole director and sole shareholder of the company when they were no longer able to make decisions, and because the correct planning had not been put in place, we actually had to ask the court to intervene to allow new people to be appointed to run the company to basically save the business. So and it would have been much simpler if the right decisions had been put in place to start with. Also, unfortunately, thought needs to be given to what could happen if there was disagreements, divorce, separation, those sorts of things, and how the family assets could be protected. One of the things that are sometimes done is that shares are put in trust, either for children who are minors, who are not yet able to own shares properly in their own right, or just even for adult children to keep the family assets within the business. So those are things that obviously we can help with, working very closely with Yvette and Sylvia and our tax colleagues.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Andrew. Yes, we've had some quite interesting, I'll call it, but interesting cases, I think, haven't we, where some simple, perhaps thoughts in advance could have saved a lot of heartache, probably. But succession, yeah, really an important aspect. It's something that is needed absolutely to bring new people in and to have those changes within the roles. But of course, if you're bringing people in, there's also the other end of the spectrum, of course, which is about retirement. And it is something that is really important to think about. It can be quite a difficult subject to talk about in family and family businesses. Sometimes there is a difficulty in actually understanding when somebody should retire. If you're using a family charter and that's already been thought about, then the expectation is there, rather than it being something that comes out of the blue for somebody who's really been embedded in the business for a long time. It can set out what will happen and when and how and those sorts of things. There is a fundamental question that goes, of course, with that, which is, well, what happens when that person retires? Often they will be, whether they're in their 60s, 70s, or even 80s, are still working and operating at a high level. What happens when that role comes to an end, as it will have to come to an end? How do you use those skills? I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. That's sort of a positive aspect of it, I think, making sure that you can use those. There's I'm not sure I quite like this word yet, but I don't have an alternative for it. It's called unretirement, and it's the concept of how you don't waste the skills. So somebody may be retiring from their role. It might be quite a senior role within the organisation, but how do you capture the skills and still use them for the benefit of the individuals, the benefit of the business still, but perhaps in a slightly different way, or even for sort of the general community or something like that. As I say, I'll pick it up in a moment when I'm talking about charitable foundations. But thinking about retirement, inevitably there are thoughts in individuals' minds about what does it mean for me from a personal tax planning point of view, and from the business planning point of view, how does that work? And of course, all the legal bits that go around it. So Yvette, I'm going to hand it over to you again and say, what are some of the issues that you've been tackling with clients as they're coming to their retirement or thinking about their retirement and planning how they approach that?
Yes, thanks, Sylvia. I mean, we find as clients approach retirement that inheritance tax often tends to be the one that comes into focus. And I've touched a little bit already on the tax reliefs for gift of shares. But of course, a lifetime gift of shares isn't always appropriate. And many clients take an active decision to retain shares in the family company to pass on later on their death, in order that they can continue to enjoy company dividends to fund their income needs in retirement. And this can be really good planning, especially where business relief is going to be available from inheritance tax, and that can apply on death. And perhaps instead the senior family member holds on to the shares and focuses their lifetime gifting on other assets they may have that don't qualify for tax reliefs. So general investment assets and other things they may hold, perhaps are the better thing to give away to hopefully benefit their estate on death with the tax due. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning where company dividends are excess to needs, perhaps particularly in later life, then the regular gifts out of income exemption can be a very valuable one for inheritance tax purposes. And where this is carefully implemented, it means that value can be passed outside of the estate immediately for tax purposes. So you often hear tax people talk about the 7-year rule. Any gift is potentially exempt and then becomes fully exempt after 7 years. With the regular gifts exemption, we can sidestep that 7 years and things are immediately exempt. But lots of potential pitfalls there, so certainly one to take advice on. In any sort of lifetime gifting strategy, though, I'm always want to be cautious with clients in terms of how much to give away, because we don't want anyone to be left short. And in particular, later life care can be very expensive. And everyone needs to be prepared that they might be in that situation. That generally there's no specific tax advantages from funding care home fees through a family business, as this would be treated as an employment benefit. So it's definitely an area that thought needs to be given to in advance, particularly when capital perhaps is being depleted. Another one that comes up frequently to both Sylvia and I'm sure, is how to maximise tax reliefs when we're thinking about planning. Particularly this valuable business relief from inheritance tax with the 100% exemption for gifts. So many businesses that we work with, particularly where they're multi-generational, been around a long time, they've perhaps diversified into slightly different activities through the generations, and lots of clients have found themselves investing in property. Perhaps they're properties that were used by the business prior and they've retained those now, and perhaps they're let to third parties. So looking at how that type of composite business is structured, and perhaps implementing a demerger to split the businesses, can be a really interesting way to maximise and preserve tax reliefs. So in a couple of examples that we've worked on over sort of prior months, we've split a business in order to enable the older generation to take forward investment type assets to fund retirement, and to give the younger generation opportunity to push forward with the trading aspects of the business and make their mark, if you like, in running that element of family operations. And this type of planning can be really great to preserve historical value in the business, but it also works well where we've got larger families who perhaps have diverging interests, and one part of the family want to take forward one aspect of the business, and another part of the family take forward a different part. And we can achieve these sort of demergers largely in a tax neutral way. So definitely something worth exploring if you find yourself in that large sort of composite business arrangement. Just thinking about retirement again, another aspect that comes up time and time again is how a business can provide an ongoing income, perhaps for a surviving spouse, maybe where the breadwinner spouse has worked in the business and then sadly passed away. They want to think about how they can provide for their spouse going forward and give them that security. And part of that perhaps can be ensuring that surviving spouse is taken care of, but perhaps they don't have any, or perhaps very limited, responsibility in the business. So share ownership can be the answer here. If someone's going to stand in that position of investor that we talked about at the beginning and receive a regular dividend income, which could be enshrined in a shareholders agreement or family charter to protect someone's position in those circumstances. One to watch out for that we see often is employer funded retirement benefit schemes, which could include, if a salaries continue to be paid after death, that's a reward for past services. So if it falls within the definition of these EFERBS types arrangements, there's a raft of HMRC reporting that clients can perhaps step into unwittingly. So definitely want to reach out there if you think you might be in that situation, and we can help guide you through that. Andrew, what else could we think about on retirement, do you think?
Well, one thing that's a challenge for many family businesses is if the family business has been run very successfully, maybe for one or two generations, what happens if the next generation don't want to be involved or don't want to be fully involved? How can the family extract some value or some cash from the business? So there's a number of ways that we can help with that. One of which is if people want to step aside, that if there's excess cash in the business and excess profits, the company can buy back some of its own shares, take back some shares from the people who won't be involved anymore, and give them money for their shares. Alternatively, if there's going to be a larger exit for the family from the business, one option is a management buyout, an MBO. What that can often involve is if there's existing management involved in the business, either who are or aren't part of the family. They could maybe get some bank finance and use that to buy out the shares from the existing shareholders and family shareholders. Another thing that's quite popular, and we've been doing for a lot of businesses, is selling the business to an employee ownership trust, or EOT. And in very simple terms, if a majority stake in the business is sold to a trust for the benefit of the employees, that transaction can be free of capital gains tax, and again would be funded from largely from cash and future profits of the business. And finally, if people really do want to exit off the business, and for whatever reason that the other two options I mentioned aren't achievable, there's obviously the possibility of a trade sale and just selling the business to a competitor or other buyers who might want to buy it. But obviously those are other things that we can help with as well.
And of course, Andrew, after any sale or something like that, then there's a lot of planning to do with cash now that people have. And I think so the planning and the work doesn't really end at that point. And sometimes that's quite sad, I suppose, with a family business if it does end in that. But it is a practical point, I think, that has to be considered. I think that you can't necessarily assume that the next generation will want to take on the business unless it can be changed or moved or something. So we do see some of that, but there's quite a lot of longevity as well, I think, in quite a number of our family business clients that we see. And I think just coming back around thinking about retirement, although this isn't necessarily something just for retirees, to be perfectly honest, but it is something that is often thought about when you have a group or an individual that's been really key in the business that's retiring, and that's a charitable foundation. And this has been around for a long time, but I think just over the last couple of years, it's seen really quite an explosion with these, where they're being really interesting. And I think that's for a number of reasons. But it is something that businesses, and family businesses in particular, but businesses are doing a lot. And the foundation is a way for family business to sort of honour the legacy. So you've referred to those businesses as they're moving on a little bit and maybe changing with the next generation. Very often there's a feeling that whilst perhaps something is moving and you're morphing your family group into something new, you want to honour what happened with the foundation of it. And this is a way of honouring it and really remembering the people who founded the family business. So it could be a foundation that's set up and it's maybe involved with education or something, or giving back to the business community or to the community that you're in that sector. I think it's really ideal where you have people heading into retirement, and it was that unretirement sort of thing of how can you use the skills. So these may well be people at the sort of senior end who've accumulated a huge amount of information, skills, experience, understanding, knowledge, and also visibility in whatever sector you're in. And whilst you don't want them to have to keep working forever, it would be quite nice to use some of that value that they have built up. So putting them into a sort of charitable foundation area where they can sort of build that up, maybe it would help with recruitment. I've seen that work quite well. So, sort of giving something back to colleges and whatever, and being there and having your name out in the public is really good. Anybody who works with me knows I like to have more than one plus for anything that a business does. Yvette, I'm going to just segue off slightly, because the most important point I wanted to make before I go rambling is about the tax efficiency of having a charitable foundation that's set up by the business. Can you just talk us through what you've done with those? I know we've done a couple together.
Yes, of course. And I think that the key point that clients often want to hear is that corporation tax relief is available for donations to a charitable foundation. It doesn't matter that it's connected with your business, or we have similar trustees and so on, where everything's set up in the way that it needs to be. You can make donations during the year, and that will reduce the company's income subject to tax. And it perhaps even more exciting than that, for family members who might wish to top up the foundation through a gift in their will, there's a reduced rate of inheritance tax that can apply to the balance of the estate. So rather than the 40% applying on death, when you give enough to charity through your will, 36% will apply, which is a massive saving for a large estate, certainly.
And it is quite a large amount that you have to give, but if that's something that you're really invested in, just as a sort of headline on it, it is a really good way of doing it. And it may not just be the retirees, of course, it could be somebody coming through the system that actually really has a passion for something, and it's a way that you can actually use that charitable foundation, because the back of that is that for your ESG, that might be something really important in attracting people in. We're seeing it. I think it's true for all ages, she said, as somebody who's at the older end. You want to work for a business where you feel proud that they are doing the right thing and that they're trying very well. But certainly the younger generation articulate it very loudly, that they want to be somewhere where they can see demonstrated that the business is actually doing things for the community. So having that charitable foundation gives you that perspective. But also, I think if you are pitching for public sector contracts, sometimes it's really good to be able to demonstrate that. So it's a really virtuous circle. It has tax elements, which Yvette said are exciting, but they are, yeah. So, but it has the tax elements in it, which give you the plus side of it. It is something very worthwhile where you can use those skills and benefits. We were talking about retirees, where you can use those retirees' knowledge of the sector and in the business community. And it also is good publicity, I guess. It keeps your name out there. So I think we've covered quite a few of those bits and pieces. I mean, obviously, I'm not missing you out, Andrew. There is a legal constitution to it, which has to be put in place and to register it as a charity. Now, I've been monitoring and scribbling down a few questions as we've gone through, and we've got quite a lot of questions, actually more than I thought we were going to get. So I've been trying to amalgamate a few of them. So if you wondered what I was doing when I was scribbling just now. The first one, I think, is really around shares. So I'm going to amalgamate. We've got three probably questions. Have asked about Alphabet shares, and you mentioned those in passing. The questions, if I amalgamate them together, are sort of, what are they? What do you mean when you talk about Alphabet shares? What are the advantages and disadvantages and the possible disputes and problems that might really come out of those? So can I hand that to you, because that's really about tax?
Okay. Well, just to recap a little of what I said earlier, Alphabet shares is where a company has multiple share classes. And these would be created in the company's articles of association, deferring to Andrew there on the legal detail, of course. Typically, these shares would be named A, B, and C, and so on, like the letters of the alphabet. And this type of setup can be a useful way to pay different dividends around the family, as it presents directors with an option, an opportunity to pay dividends only on the A shares, for example, to benefit the A shareholders. So I would say, Sylvia, as you imagine, these type of Alphabet shares are a minefield. And I did mention briefly before, HMRC don't like it when those type of arrangements are used as disguised remuneration, which ought to have been taxed as earnings, or perhaps also when they're used very aggressively to divert income to non or lower rate taxpayers in the family. And so they would be the major perhaps disadvantages. In terms of possible disputes, I think you mentioned as well, Sylvia. I mean, you can see a potential risk of a dispute, I suppose, if the A shareholders are seen to be benefiting ahead of the B shareholders, or a scenario like that. And this, I think Andrew would say, is where a well-drafted shareholders agreement and or family charter would come in to help you. So managing expectations up front about who's going to be in a position to take what from the family business and how that arrives in their hands, really.
I think they used to be very popular, didn't they, going back a few years, perhaps a little too popular, and they were used. There is a sense that they make sense for a certain level, but if you then end up with everybody, I think, having a different alphabet number and then very suspect division of amounts coming out, I think from a tax point of view, that's probably quite aggressive tax planning, maybe. See, I think from a business running point, so where I would look at it from a business point of view, I think if you have very clear rules and expectations about why a certain dividend would be given to a particular alphabet number, and that's agreed by everybody in advance, then you avoid that surprise and the disgruntled kind of feelings that can come. So I think they can be really useful, but I think they can be very divisive as well. And as you've sort of highlighted, I think from a tax point of view, they may well be questioned. Now, you might have some very good answers for why you're doing particular things, but I think they are seen as quite aggressive when they're used in a particular way. Are there better ways of really dealing with that? There probably are. But we do see, I mean, we do have quite a few clients who have some alphabet shares, probably not at the aggressive end, so using every letter of the alphabet. But we do, I've heard in various other previous incarnations where I was working where they would be used to that limit. But I don't think we see that quite so much these days. But yeah, alphabet shares could be useful. Make sure you construct them. Andrew will definitely say, got to have proper documentation in place, otherwise they just simply won't work.
And one thing that's really important, Sylvia, is if people do them a bit too casually and just so the directors have the ability to decide how much profit goes to each class of shares. And what happens if the directors are always putting the money towards one or two classes and leaving out the others, that can really give rise to a dispute and questions about whether the directors are acting in accordance with their duties. So it really is important that if you're doing that, to set out some rules in the company's articles of association as to what profit shares the different classes can receive.
And I think so. Probably our answer to that, as it will be for lots of things, is if you're going to do something like that, then it's important to think about it in advance and take some professional advice, I think, to avoid heartache and worry later on. But yes, I mean, I think they are useful and can be used. I've got some other questions. I've been trying to put these together. So I think this is really one for Andrew, because it's around some of the legal parts of it. So I'm taking a couple, I've been scribbling them down. So I'm part of a large family business. We've got multiple generations and new generations wanting to join the business, which is really good. So they've got people wanting to come in, but they do have different ideas about how the business should be run. They've got different, I suspect, going into different sectors or something. So what can we do to manage risks when we have that sort of situation where we've got people coming in on a very positive basis, really, that you've got the next generation in, but doing something different, perhaps with some of it? How do we manage the risks within the business, and how could we look to perhaps restructure the business with that in mind? So sorry, it's a bit rambly, but
no, it's a really good question, Sylvia. I mean, if you've got people coming into the business with different with different interests or different areas that they want to focus on, and maybe that creates a little bit of tension that some people want to take the business in one direction, others have different priorities. It might be worth seeing if the business can be split up into separate divisions or some sort of a demerger, where different people who want to focus on different things can do that with the freedom and support under the family umbrella, but also without people being exposed to risks that they don't necessarily want to take or be part of. So that's something that we can definitely help with.
Absolutely. And I think you do get that, don't you, in older businesses where you've got sort of various generations, and perhaps the older generation really want to de-risk a little bit or do what they know works. But also you've got that dynamic of needing to evolve the business as well. So there are some risks. So the idea of splitting is sometimes a really good one. And I know we've certainly done that with some of the businesses. But there are sort of other issues around tax as well. So if you had perhaps a new entity start, I'm not straying into tax, Yvette, but she'll stop me in a moment. But if you have them all together, then perhaps losses from the new business that's starting up can be usefully used, perhaps in the rest of the group. It isn't always a straightforward answer, is it? But certainly, I think if you are a business and you say that it's quite a large business, and there are there's new generations want to come in, I think the last thing you want to do is to put them off coming into the business, because that's going to be the lifeblood. We've talked about succession, and maybe having more in your family charter about the things they can do. So you do want to give people their heads to go ahead and use the family business to grow and develop further. After all, that's what the founders probably did, if you look back a few generations, but also in a sort of safe and controlled environment. So we do see that in some of the family charters. I do bang on about that a lot, but we do see that, and it's about setting sort of the perimeter as to where they can work, and then if you need to go further. I think it could be that it's not even just bloodlines, and we've sort of referred mostly in what we're talking about with bloodlines, but some family businesses are defining themselves as family business, where it's maybe three guys went to uni together, came up with a brilliant idea and have worked together. So they're not direct bloodlines, but it's about that knowledge and the understanding of individuals. And it may be about bringing management into the team, because not always your family, the bloodlines, or whoever's from the founders may not have the skill base available. So I think the fact that you've got new generations wanting to come into your business is great, but not all businesses have that. So I think some of the ideas, some of the things you were talking about, Andrew, around defining what people are doing might be useful for bringing in some of the management team. Do you not think, Yvette, on the tax side of it? I strayed a little bit into that at my peril, but I don't think that's wrong. It's about something to think about, isn't it? About how you could use some of those losses.
Definitely. Well, when we're operating in a group like that, Sylvia, with a new business, you're quite right. You would expect to have group relief through a corporate group. So maybe it's not the time to demerge something if we are in that situation. So timing's everything. It's always the case with any type of planning, isn't it?
It is. It's understanding, isn't it? It's about revisiting and understanding. So I've got another question. Actually quite a lot of the questions are around the charter, so the family charter. So I haven't done it justice in what I was talking about, but I will touch on it now. So the question I've sort of amalgamated from two different ones is, we have what is quite a large family business. We don't have a charter, and we never have. And a lot of the things that we do, we just do because we do, or we don't because we don't. So the charter looks really interesting, but where do you start? Who do you get involved? And how long does it take? Those are really big questions. I cannot answer those in 3 lines, but what I will say is, yes, it is interesting. And I think, a lot of businesses have grown up. And whilst you may say you don't have a family charter, you sort of have one, but it isn't written down, I suspect. So there is a way of operating, and everybody sort of understands it, except probably not everybody understands it, or people will understand it from their own points of view. So the purpose of writing it down is that it's very clear and it can be revisited and understood. So I think you probably do, if you are a sort of well-established business, that you probably do have a charter, as I say, but it's not written down. It is something that, where do you start? Well, okay, I'll start with the first part of that question. Where do you start? Well, I would start, like any building, if you remember the structure, it had a foundation. And I would start with those foundations. So it's about the values and vision. Now, that's either going to be really easy to do, because everybody who sits around will say, well, obviously we stand for this. This is what we want to do. Or you may find in that discussion that there's quite a few divergent discussions that go on and thoughts about it. And one of the things I always say to the clients when they're doing this is that actually it's that discussion that is of the most benefit to you, because at that point you've got the structure for a discussion about a huge subject, which everybody knows a bit about but has their own sort of perspective on. So having a structure as to, we're going to talk about this, you may all have the same view, but you may just not. But it's actually useful to have that debate, and if you can come to a conclusion where everybody agrees and that you can articulate it, it isn't something that has to be written in stone. It can change over time, but it's your starting point. So I would start with the foundation. Now, what happens if you get stuck? They're so far apart. I would say you probably do need somebody to facilitate and to ask those obvious questions sometimes, because it is quite hard if you're part of something to have a genuine discussion. So to have your meetings facilitated. But if you still can't get past it, what do you do? Because I've had that question where we've gone round and round sometimes, is to put it to one side and to come back. It's a bit like an exam question, you do the easy bits first and get the bits where everybody agrees. That's laughing at me, but genuinely sometimes you have to look for something where somebody, your group actually agrees. It's a practical point. So it may be that you move up and you say, well, let's talk about governance. How many times a year should we meet? What should we discuss, and how should we produce reports, or something like that? And you'll start to find there are areas where you start to agree, but then you need to go back and rebuild that foundation. So I would genuinely start with the foundation on that. I'll move on. Sorry, let me carry on. Who do you get involved? Well, it depends again. So I would say if you're starting to draft something out to begin with, I would start with the people that are involved in the business, because they will this is about the family and the business. But if you're not involved in the business, it's pretty hard to have an input to it. I would start out so that you could get a draft of the family charter. And when you've worked your way through all of those areas, you can go back out and say to the rest of the family, so they may be the people who are, Betta's talked about, the investors, they just have the shareholding in it. They don't get involved in the day-to-day, but it's something that you can produce for them to say, look, this is our draft. This is what we think we stand for. This is how we're going to run the business. This is how people move through it. This is the retirement. So that it's something that you can put as a, not a fait accompli, but it's got some meat to it already. It is about culture. It's about making sure that it fits in with the culture that you have in your business already. So how do you work? And if it doesn't fit, how are you going to get that culture to move? And I did also say you're going to have to renew it and look at it. And how long does it take? Oh my goodness. Well, how long is a piece of string? You know, if you all agree, it's going to be reasonably easy, but no, you're not going to get it done on a Wednesday afternoon and then be finished with it. That discussion and the debate and the structure that charter gives you to that discussion is really useful. And I've had clients come back and say, actually, it's great, we've got this, but you know what was brilliant? We talked about stuff that we had never talked about before for our business. And we realized either completely in agreement or I hadn't realized somebody wanted to do this or whatever. So it is a fantastic tool for just being a sort of agnostic question. You know, how, you know, I'm just looking at my thing there. What about communication? How do we communicate with different people? It isn't necessarily a question that, you know, families will ask themselves because it's how you do it and you've done it always. And great grandfather Bob used to do it like this and that's how we still do it. So it's not necessarily true. I'm going to say before I stop talking about it though, that Andrew will be thinking, that sounds great, Sylvia, but some of the things that come out of it, and we've already talked about it, is about the legal side of it. So it's like a wish list. It's like a construct for it. But I think probably for you, Andrew, if you can have something like that, it informs you of the wishes of those in that business and the individuals. And then you take over with all of your very technical legal documentation.
Yeah, and it's important to agree, you know, whether the charter's, you know, legally binding or whether it's just, you know, a guide as to what we're going to put in place with the legal documents. But it's nice, as you said, if the family can sit together just and agree some principles at the start to guide how they want to move forward with things.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things, I think, that once you've done it, it is hard to start off. So, you know, that the person who asked the question said they haven't got anything like it. And I sort of dismissed that a bit and said, you have got it, but it's not written down. But it is hard to do it the first time, but it's really interesting. And once you've got it, the renewal of it is good. And when you have perhaps, you know, from the previous question where you've got new generations coming in and wanting to do something wholly different from what you've done before, you can add to your charter to identify what's happening. You can understand and manage the risks, which is what it's all about. And it is one of those things I think that's really interesting to do. It is quite hard work and you won't get it all done at once, but you can go back and chip away at it and create it.
Yeah. Well, with Christmas coming, it's a lovely time of year to sit down and have these chats, isn't it?
You're not suggesting doing it round the Christmas table, are you?
Why not? Why not?
Well, if you all agree, it will be great, and probably better than doing a jigsaw, but absolutely. I mean, I've got lots of other questions that are coming in. I can't really amalgamate too many of them, but what I did want to say is that if you do, I don't think we're going to get a chance to answer all of them. So we will come back to everybody that has asked a question and we will come back to you individually. So we have your emails. So, and even the ones where I've amalgamated, I have missed some bits out. So I've kind of put them into 3 questions. I did want to say, but really, thank you to everybody for your attendance today. It's the first that we've done for this webinar. Our group, our family business group, is bigger than the people that are sitting here, and we have lots more things that we want to talk about. And I hope that in the discussions that we've had, where we've covered some very basic areas and then gone on to some little bit more of an in-depth on it, what we will do in subsequent webinars is to take some of those areas. We have some coming up, but after that, we'll pick out if there is a particular interest in an area and really look at those in a bit more depth and understanding and give some more ideas and also warnings where people are doing things, because we have seen some things where we sort of slight intake of breath sometimes. So the planning is great, but it's all about how you actually sort of implement things. But hopefully you have found 1 or 2 nuggets, even if it is something to think about around the Christmas table and to talk about. If you do want to speak to any of us or any of the rest of our team, if you go to the MKS website and find our page, if you just search for family business, we have a page where we've got lots of things and details and ideas on there, and you'll find our emails and our contact numbers so you can get in touch with any of us or anybody else on our team. And if you would like to join our mailing list, then please do drop me a line and we can pop you on there and you'll receive our bulletin. We don't send out lots of stuff, but we do send out relevant things and updates. So don't worry, you won't be inundated with lots of emails. But if you also have any ideas for any other topics, particularly which you'd just like us to cover, then we could do that. And we have a lot of specialists who can go into far more detail. We do have our next webinar that has been planned, and that's going to be in the new year. We don't think we want to do anything more before Christmas. It's far too close to that. And we're going to be looking at decision making and how family businesses can make decisions, which I think is one of those things that can be a bit of a sticking point sometimes. And we'll mail out those details in the new year, and you'll see lots of posts that come out about that. But I want to say just once again, thank you for your attendance. And thank you absolutely to Andrew and Yvette, who were far more technical and detailed than I was. I just look at the business side of things. But thank you so much for your help. And have a very good Christmas, and hopefully we'll regroup in the new year.
Great.
Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.